Hello and welcome to another episode of Geography Made Easy. In these videos, we try to make difficult geographical concepts easy. Today, we will be dealing with the chapter Migration Trends. Now, migration is a very important concept in population geography. When we talk about population dynamics, that is the movement of population, it is usually through a phenomena or process called migration. Migration is when people, or in case of animals as well, when they move from one place to the other. Of course, in this chapter, we are going to concentrate on human migration. Migration has very interesting socio-economic impacts, and that is the reason why migration becomes a very important topic in political, economic, social and demographic conditions of a country. Migration sometimes influences policy making, and migration can also lead to political implications in any country. So firstly, we are going to look at a few basic terms when we try to understand what is migration. Firstly, let us try to define the term migration. Migration is the movement of people from one place to another. When there is a permanent movement, that is, one person moves permanently from one place to the other, it is called a permanent migration. Whereas when a person moves either in a particular season, it is called seasonal, or in case if it's a yearly phenomena which happens every year, it is called annual migration. Now, there is something very interesting I would like to tell. All of us, yes, all of us, we know somebody who has migrated, or we have migrated at some point of time in our lives. For example, sometimes when a child is born, they are born at the place where the mother's parents live. So after birth, after a few months maybe, or a few years maybe, the mother moves with the child to another place. This is a very common thing seen in the Indian culture, and this can lead to a permanent migration. Apart from that, every person at some point of time or their family has moved from one part of the world to the other, or one village to the city, in search of economic opportunities, in search of education, in search of better livelihood, sometimes due to natural disasters like floods, droughts. So every person has moved from one place to the other. Look around you and try to find out how many persons do you know who have migrated from some other place. Maybe your neighbor. You can go home and ask your grandparents or your parents if they have migrated from some other place to where you're currently residing. Sometimes you might be speaking a different language in comparison to the language which is spoken in the region which you live. This means that you have migrated, or your family has migrated some point of time in their lives. Now let us look who is a migrant. So any person who has migrated is called a migrant. But more, if I have to define it in a more proper manner, a migrant is a person who at the time of the census, we will be coming to that. Census is the enumeration of the number of people at a particular time period. They are enumerated other than his or her place of birth. So if you are, after your place of birth, you have moved to another place, then you are a migrant, you have migrated. Apart from that, we have two more very interesting features, or very interesting terms which are often referred in population geography and migration chapter, which is out and in migration. Now, out migration is when a person is moving out from a particular place. And in migration is the place where the person is moving into. So for example, I am a person who resides in Kolkata. I've been born and brought up here, and I moved to Delhi in search of a job. So the place of out migration in this case will be Kolkata, and the place of in migration in this case will be New Delhi. Now this can take place between two places. So the place of destination is the place where the in-migration is happening, and the place which from where the migrant is originating is the place from where out-migration is taking place. There are still a few more basic concepts we look at. One is commuting or commutation. And I'm sure you have encountered people who move from one place to the other every day in the trains or buses. Or you commute to your place of work, or you commute to school or college. So the daily movement of people between two places is called commuting. Now migration usually does not take place from one large or big city to another very big city, or from maybe a very tiny village to a big metropolis, because a migrant slowly acquires the required skills, the required amount of money to migrate from one kind of livelihood to the other. So if a person who wants to say migrate to London at some point of time in their lives, they have to follow the step migration. So somebody who lives in Bonga, which is a small place, a small town in West Bengal, first they will migrate to maybe Kolkata for their education. Then that person is going to migrate to say Mumbai or Delhi for their education. And then from there, from Delhi or Mumbai, they might be migrating out to London. So this migration is usually seen that this migration takes place in steps. Now, I will define these two terms which are very simple, which is the place of origin and place of destination. So the place where the migrant leaves, from where out migration takes place, that is the place of origin for the person. In that example which I gave, Kolkata was my place of origin. And if I am going from Kolkata to New Delhi, so very clearly I have my place of destination, which is New Delhi, and my place of origin is Kolkata. We have internal migration, which is migration which is taking place within a country, or within a state, or within a district. So internally within a political or geographical boundary, when migration is taking place, it is called internal migration. In this case, mostly when we are talking about migration taking place between a country. So this Kolkata to New Delhi will be an example of an internal migration. On the other hand, the example in which I gave from Bonga to London, that would be an international migration. Both these types of migration takes place in all countries. We have internal migration taking place very often, and we have a huge number of people having going into international migration, where they go in search of better livelihood, better job, better opportunity from one country to the other. Again, I'm sure you might be knowing a lot of people who have gone abroad for their higher education, or they have gone for jobs. They have actually undergone international migration. So migration is usually enumeration done by Census of India. So census is the body which counts or keeps the population data tally. So it is usually done, and this data is available with the Census of India. Now this enumeration of migration, when do we call migration has happened? This is basically done on two things. We look at the place of birth. So in your questionnaire, the questionnaire which the Census of India people who's coming for surveying will ask you. They'll ask you your place of birth. They look at your place of birth. So we have the lifetime migrant, the example where I gave that your mother went to her mother's house when she was pregnant, and hence she gave birth there. But then finally, after the child was 3 months or 6 months or maybe 1 year, she moved back to her in-laws house. Now this kind of migration is very commonly seen amongst children, and we see that this is because of this custom that children, it's the responsibility of the parents to look after their daughter when the daughter is going to birth. Of course, now this concept is changing, but we still see that a lot of the migration in rural areas, even in urban areas, which has taken place, which is place of birth has changed, is because of this in India. So that migrant is the lifetime migrant, and we have the place of residence. So the place of residence is different during the last census year. So maybe in the last census year I was living in Kolkata, and now after 10 years because of my work I'm living in Bangalore. So my place of residence has changed and I become a migrant. Now we'll go into details about out migration and in migration. I will briefly summarize these because these are given in a lot of details. But I will just explain what they are and why they happen, because we really don't need to go into too much of details. So out migration is when when they moved into other countries. And we see three waves usually. This is for Indian diaspora, where we see that we have the British period where the laborers were sent to certain islands. If you have read any book by Amitav Ghosh, who is a very famous writer, you might have come across this kind of migration written by him. I'll give you an example here. We have the Ibis trilogy, and it's based on this migration. Then we have the second wave where migration took place. People went to neighboring countries, so Bangladesh, Pakistan, Nepal, Bhutan, Myanmar, Sri Lanka, as well as Africa. Now, this migration has taken place. There has been a lot of socio-economic connotations associated with this kind of movement, but we do see the second wave of migration taking place when people went out to these countries for a better quality of life, or they had to move out because of, we'll come into that, because of partition. One of the persons who migrated temporarily, but he was also a migrant, to South Africa was Gandhiji. So we do have people, or people who have, most of people during the British period have migrated to England as well to study law and the get trained in advanced education so that they can come back and serve the country better. So yes, that has taken place as well. And finally, we have the third wave, which is mostly from 1970s onwards. And again, here I am giving you another example. If you have read the book Lowland by Jhumpa Lahiri, there is this example when in 1970s, one of the protagonists in the book, he moves out, he goes to US for his PhD, and finally he settles there. So we have seen this kind of migration where people moved um, to USA, Canada, England, Europe for better opportunity. And this kind of migration still is existing today, where people from the developing nations are moving into the more developed nations for a better standard of living. Now, here I want to mention about partition of India. Partition of India has played a very, very crucial and important role in migration, where a boundary divided the country into two parts, East Pakistan, West Pakistan. And a lot of people started moving across the borders based on religion. Pakistan would predominantly become a Muslim nation, so the Hindus did not feel safe. They started migrating towards India, and similarly, we have the Muslims. A lot of Muslims moving back to Pakistan, feeling that they'll be safer there. Now, this kind of mass migration has been very rare, but this has been prevalent in India, and it has been a horrific kind of experience with a lot of people facing riots, trauma, there has been political unrest, there has been missing people. The partition has left its scar over the Indian subcontinent through one of the historic mass migrations that was seen those times. So yes, partition is something which is very important and should be mentioned. Now, if I talk about in-migration, that is people other parts of uh, from other parts of the world coming into India and settling. Now, this has been throughout history. It has taken place. Whom we can we call as the real Indians, and whom do we call as migrants who come in and settled and amalgamated and become a part of the diaspora we have today. So the people from Central Asia, people from China, people from Asian countries, mostly people from Europe, they have at different points of time. We know Alexander the Great invaded India, and of course that was migration. Some of his Greek armies, they say, have were left behind. They migrated, settled down here. We see the Aryans who came in from Central Asia were migrants who came here to settle down here. So historically, different phases we see later many invasions taking place, the Mughals coming from Afghanistan, and even before that, the Middle Eastern people coming into India. We see scholars coming in into India, some of them settling and staying back here, leading to cultural amalgamations. And of course, later we see the Europeans like the Portuguese, the British, the French coming into India, migrating in phases, which has taken place over in the Indian history throughout the ages has been something which is very interesting. Currently, however, we see a problem which has cropped up where we see people from the neighboring countries seeking refuge in India from political unrest, and we have called them as refugees. They have been given a term which is an international term. In this case, we have people from Bangladesh, from Tibet, from Afghanistan, Sri Lanka, and Myanmar forming one of the most important refugees we have in New Delhi and in many other places, Tibetan colonies, Majnu Katila. Now, that Tibetan colony happened because people from Tibet migrated into India. We have the Civil War of 1983 and then later 1995 from Sri Lanka, which triggered mass migration. 1970s onwards, and of course in phases, we have seen people from East Pakistan and later Bangladesh moving into India. And even today, there is movements which are taking place. So in this way, we see migration migration taking place into the Indian subcontinent. Now I will just briefly discuss what are the causes of migration. Now this is an important question and they can ask small subparts because the causes are important because they determine and define why people migrate. People migrate for work and employment reasons. One of the most important reasons, of course, we all know. For employment reasons, for jobs, people move. Another very important factor is education. For educational purposes, for better educational opportunities, people move from one place to the other. Now, marriage, the third point in India, is a very major cause for migration, mostly with females, where people move from their residence to their in-laws' place or where their husbands stay. Moved after birth, as I have discussed. You're born in your grandmother, maternal grandparents' place, and then you move to your paternal grandparents or you just with your parents. So that is also one of the reasons why migration can take place. Moved with household. If your house has moved, you move as well. So your family has migrated and you migrate. Business purposes. We see the Marwari diaspora throughout in the Indian subcontinent, even in Africa and even in some cases in European countries. US. So they have moved because of business, for business purposes. This is a very interesting reason for movement. Next is insecurity, where we have war and political disturbances. Currently, people move from Ukraine to the surrounding countries for war and political disturbance. So if there is strife and political disturbance in your country, people will move out. Now we have natural calamities who are called climate refugees. So if there's a flood, if there's a drought, if there is any kind of natural calamity, earthquake, a lot of people move out of their place of residence to other places because of loss of livelihood. So we have up coast Isla, we have seen a lot of people from the Sundarbans move into Kolkata in search of jobs after losing their livelihood. So they are the climate refugees, and that can also cause migration. And finally, we see disease. We have heard of stories where cholera swept away villages. People ran away from one place to the other in fear of disease. Of course, when COVID-19 happened, also we saw some similar kind of trends, and hence borders and flights had to be stopped so that people could move from one place to the other. So that disease can also lead to migration, especially disease which is infectious. They usually lead to these large scale migrations. Migration can affect the area from which migration is happening as well as the area which migration is happening. Let us look at each of these different kinds of effects of migration which can take place. The first effect which we have is the demographic consequence. Demographic consequence or demographic change is when the population, the age of the population or the structure of the population can change in the place of outmigration as well as in-migration. For example, in case of certain age groups of migration outmigrating to a particular area can result in a change in the population age of the area in which from where the outmigration has taken place. For example, for economic purposes, if the young population, which is the working population, if they outmigrate more, we see that either the very young population, the children, and the old, which is above 60, the dependents, their numbers increase. So this leads to a change in the demography of the particular area. Apart from that, we also see that sometimes when we see that the males, they dominantly outmigrate from one area to the other in search of employment opportunities, and this very commonly leads to an increase in the number of females in the area from which outmigration is taking place. Again, this has a demographic consequence. So this kind of change in the population structure is one of the reasons or effects of migration into the area where migration is taking place and from the area from which the migration has taken place. Next, we have social consequences, which is the societal changes which takes place when people migrate from one place to the other. This social consequence is mostly seen in areas where we see that the immigration has taken place. So in cities, we see that different people from diverse cultures, ethnicities, they come and they live in this area, and that leads to different kinds of food being eaten, different kinds of festivals being celebrated, ideas, technologies, habits, customs, they get transferred from one place to the other. So this is a change in the way in the societal structure in the place where migration has taken place. So we have this multi-ethnic culture which develops in these large cities or urban areas, and this is because of the migration of different streams of people from different parts of the world. Any global city or any very large metropolitan city, usually there has this kind of a change which can be seen. Next, we have the economic consequence. Now, we have already discussed that economics is one of the major driving forces behind migration. So, the kind of change which one sees when people migrate from one place to the other is that the occupational structure, the dependency ratios, which we have again discussed, that changes when people in and out migrate from a particular area. So the earning members of the population might be in migrating to larger urban areas and out migrating from smaller rural areas. So this leads to a economic consequence or change. So we sometimes see development also trickling down to certain places because of migration. For example, in many parts of India, we see that people migrate to the cities from villages, and they send the money which they earn back to the village so that the houses and other things can be repaired and built. Now, this is directly a result of migration where we see the economy changes because of migration. Next, we have the environmental migration. Now, in this case, we are going to look at overcrowding, especially in case of urban areas, where we see that when in-migration has taken place, it leads to overcrowding. It leads to a very bad kind of environment in which people are living, leads to pollution. And I'm talking about the environmental consequence of migration, mostly in case of developing nations where we see that cities become very overcrowded. Price or rent of the houses go up. That is also one of the things which happens due to overcrowding. And what happens is pollution increases. So standard of health of people living in this area, the migrants, might not be very good. The last part is the other consequences which take place due to migration. And here, from the place where migration is taking place, we see that there is a human resource loss. So from India, if people are migrating to USA, especially if educated people are migrating, then we see that there is a brain drain or loss of human resource which is taking place. So we see that this impact is felt in the place from where migration has taken place, and on the other hand, the reverse happens to the place where migration is taking place. We see that the pull factor which attracts the people to this area, this helps in developing the economy. It helps in uh, developing the environment of that particular area. See the cultural diversity getting. So it's very important to acknowledge the push and the pull factors of migration. So the pull factor is the factor which pulls people towards a location, and push factor is the factor which pushes people out of a place because of certain reasons. For example, war, conflict, disease, which we have talked about. Pull factor is economic opportunities or any other kind of opportunity can act as a pull factor for people to migrate from one place to the other. So we have basically four streams of migration which is commonly seen. The first one is rural to rural migration. The second one is rural to urban migration, which is very common in India. The third one is urban to urban migration, and the fourth one is urban to rural migration, which is rare. Rural to rural migration is seen when people from one village migrate to the other village, and this is mostly associated with female migrants who migrate from their parents' house to their in-laws' place. after marriage. This is a mass movement and it is seen all throughout India. It is very, very common even to this day. And the second kind of people who migrate are the agricultural laborers. The agricultural laborers migrate during the harvesting season. So we see that when the surplus people are required for harvesting, laborers would migrate from one village to the other. So these two basically types of rural to rural migration is seen in. The rural to urban migration is very common, where people in search of livelihood, in search of educational opportunities, in search of employment, migrate from the rural areas to the urban areas. So there is a push factor which is taking place from the rural areas, lack of opportunities, lack of infrastructure, less income, towards the urban centers which act as the pull factors. Most of the large cities in India, the big cities, the metropolitan cities, this have historically been associated with this pull factor, where we see that it has grown and they are still growing. For example, the Delhi NCR region, where we see that the surrounding areas are also slowly becoming urbanized. And this is because the pull factor of Delhi, which is the capital of India, is huge on the hinterland, not only on the hinterland but throughout India, where people are going to Delhi for employment opportunities, which is in many cases better than smaller towns or certain cities. So Delhi slowly has a huge pull factor for people to move from rural areas, and we can see that it is slowly a kind of a urbanization is taking place in and around what we knew as Delhi into the NCR region, as well as also it has a pull factor as people from urban areas are also moving towards that. And from there we move into the third type, which is urban to urban migration, where we see that from smaller towns to bigger cities with more opportunities, people would tend to migrate. In this case, we have already spoken about step migration, where we see that people move from villages, then to small towns, and then further to cities, and then to larger metropolitan cities. And so the urban to urban migration basically takes place because of employment opportunities, because of educational opportunities, because of better standard of living, and people seek a better kind of livelihood, and hence they move from one city to the other. So it's mostly related to jobs, tertiary, secondary, tertiary, quaternary and quinary kind of sectors, as well as also education, which again then finally leads to a better opportunity in the job market. Finally, we have the fourth stream, which is the urban to rural migration, which is very rare in case of India. This is seen mostly in the developed nations, where old people, after retirement, what they do is they out-migrate from cities due to poor living conditions, due to congestion, due to traffic jams, and they move into the countryside, into the villages, where in the rural areas, where they can live a better life. It's open, it's with cleaner air, with wider roads. So in order to do that, in order to live a more peaceful life, they tend to move from urban to rural areas. This is not so much seen in India because again medical facilities are not that well developed in rural areas in the developing nations. But in the developed nations, we see that medical facilities are quite well developed even in the countryside or rural areas, and hence for older people it does not become a hindrance if they move from large metropolitan cities to smaller towns or to villages in order to experience a better life. So finally, I have come to the end of the topic. I will just quickly discuss what are the important questions which can come for the exam. So for this chapter, I think reasons, like reasons for types of migration, why in migration is taking place at a particular area, why out migration is taking place at a particular area, what are the reasons for in migration, or what is the reason for step migration. These kinds of reasons, rather reasoning type of questions, can be very commonly seen from this chapter. And one needs to understand it's not very difficult, but it has logical reasons. So if you can think logically, you'll be able to understand why the reasoning part is important in case of the migration chart. Next is differences. Differences between terms. So terminologies, we have already discussed the definitions, which can also come as 2-mark questions, as well as differences, which can come for 3 to 4-mark questions, where we see that differences between push and pull factor, difference between in-migration and out-migration, difference between a migrant and a migration and commuting. So a difference between urban area, rural area. These are very important questions or very important things which can come from this chart. And finally, we have the consequences of migration, or what is the effect of migration, which can also be looked into. So these kinds of questions have come in the previous years. They can give you a graph where they can tell you that have to understand what kind of migration has taken place. You have to have some little bit of idea about data and graphical representation of data and interpretation of those graphs. And if those can be done, then I don't think it will be a problem. So if you want me to bring out, discuss with you some of these questions more as to what has come in the previous years, for example, graphical questions with graphs, I can do that. Please put a comment in the video so that I can know that if you want to make such a video. So if you have any doubts and questions, please comment in the chat section, and we shall meet in the next video. So thank you very much for listening.